Alright, so this is just basically a recording just of some of the key things from last year's exam that people need to improve on. Basically, just to improve the quality of your answers, some of the main things that people need to just touch on, actually explain really clearly as opposed to just sort of glossing over. I'm not going to go through the whole exam, it's just some of the harder questions. First question asked you why balanced growth in both demand and supply is important for economic growth. Supply is something really important. Basically, I still don't think people really get what aggregate supply is. An aggregate supply is about improving people's willingness and ability to supply. Now, what I mean by that is if you've got 4 people in an economy and then somebody else comes along and in part of the participation rate as well, there's now more people there. You've got an increased ability to supply because you've got a 5th person. That's what aggregate supply is about. It's not about, there's more demand for products, so we think, well, are we able to meet that extra demand? It's about an economy having an increased ability to actually supply things because we've got more people. We've got more people in the workforce, or we're more productive. So if everyone's twice as good as doing what they were in the past, then we have a more productive workforce. We're able to more effectively supply things if there's an increase in demand. So you've really got to articulate properly what an actual increase in aggregate supply is. It means that the quantity and quality of our resources has improved, which basically means we've either got more resources, so we've got more people, we've got better access to technology, we've got better resources, or the quality of our resources have improved. So we've got better capital, or we've got more people in the workforce. It's not about us just supplying more because there's more demand, and it's really important you don't make that link because you will lose marks for doing that logic. So in terms of this first question, explain why balanced growth in both demand and supply is important for low inflation. You've got to define the goal first. Then you've basically got to explain, well, why is aggregate supply important? And aggregate supply is important because without aggregate supply, it's going to lead to things like shortages and capacity constraints. Because when there's more demand, we don't have the ability or the resources to actually meet that demand with increased supply. So aggregate supply is important so we can meet any additional aggregate demand with supply, and therefore we can achieve non-inflationary growth. In terms of aggregate demand, you've also got to go the other way, because this question is asking you why balanced growth in both important. So if there's inadequate aggregate demand, it's going to lead to lower prices. It's going to lead to unemployment and spare capacity, and therefore basically that's going to lead to low inflation or deflation. So the idea of having balanced aggregate demand and aggregate supply is essentially, if you're looking at like the business cycle, we're trying to avoid peaks and troughs. We're trying to avoid recessions where there's a lack of aggregate demand, but we're also trying to avoid booms because we don't have enough resources. So balanced and steady growth in aggregate demand and aggregate supply is helpful to ensure that we have sustained periods of domestic economic stability, that we have growth at low inflationary pressures. That's what's key to mention. With the second question, this is exactly what I was talking about before. You've got to be able to, it's asking you why aggregate supply is important for growth. And what you've got to be able to say is that aggregate supply represents the total volume of goods and services that we are able and willing to produce. And that, don't overcomplicate that. That just means we've got more resources, we've got more labour, we've got more capital, we've got more land, or we've just got better quality resources. So an increase in aggregate supply can increase the willingness and ability of producers to produce. And basically what you need to explain then is that we're able to meet any extra aggregate demand because we have the resources, and therefore we can allow for non-inflationary growth. You can also talk about how that boosts our international competitiveness because it keeps prices low. But it's important that you're not just saying that an increase in aggregate supply means that we're able to produce more goods and services when there's because of increased aggregate demand, or that an economy is producing more. That's not what it means. It means that we have increased access to resources or increased quality of resources. So increases in aggregate supply can also result in improved quantity on quality of resources to the business sector, boosting our productive capacity, shifting the PPF to the right, and allowing for increased gross domestic product. I'm not going to go through the demand side factors. Have a look through these yourself. When you're doing these questions, make sure you're linking it to the components of aggregate demand. You're not going to get full marks if you don't link it to consumption, investment spending, or exports before you link it to aggregate demand. Also, don't use investment spending as an example of a demand side factor. Lower commodity prices or the lower terms of trade is your demand side factor, and then you link that to investment spending through your answer, or lower disposable income for consumers. Don't use lower investment spending as the actual demand side factor. 1D, you can go through this yourself as well. Make sure you're doing solid answers on trade liberalisation and environmental policies. Key thing with environmental policies is that you're linking it to the short term and it can hurt growth, and then it's good in the long term because it preserves infrastructure, etc., etc. With trade liberalisation, try and mention recent free trade agreements. And the 2 key things you always have to mention is that it encourages us to be more productive because there's more competition, and that we shift resources to areas of comparative advantage. They're the buzzwords the examiners are going to be looking for. This one here, this was a really tough question. This was basically asking you about the compatible nature between budgetary and monetary policy last year. Some of the key things that you'd want to talk about for this question is, first of all, define what both the policies did. Sorry, went a bit too fast there. So explain what's happening with monetary policy in 2016, explain what's happening with budgetary policy in 2016, how one's being highly expansionary because inflation is below the target zone, and one is being more contractionary, focusing on fiscal consolidation to try and reduce public sector debt. And then you've got to talk about an actual logical, sophisticated relationship between the two. And one of the ones that I like is that there's a lot of investment spending. There's a lot of there's the lower company tax rates are fueling investment spending. So the lower company tax rates are combining and being compatible with the lower cash rate because they're both encouraging firms to invest. The lower company tax rates increase after-tax profits and encourage investment spending. The lower cash rate will increase the incentive to borrow because it's cheaper. That's a good compatibility between the two. Lower cash rate and lower company tax rates. In terms of another compatibility is that because we have a more contractionary budget, it's reducing the problems with crowding out. So the government doesn't have to finance it by borrowing from the private sector. That's helping to keep interest rates low and supporting the monetary policy stance as well. So they're your compatibilities. One, the interest rates and the company tax rates. Two, the lack of crowding out. And then you've got to be able to explain what both of the policies are actually doing in this year's budget for full marks. You can also talk about the long term and how reserving public sector finances will help boost growth and make it sustainable in the long term. Would be another sophisticated response. 2A and 2B I'm not going to go into in much detail. You can have a look at these. Make sure you're providing enough detail though. A lot of people are saying that perfectly competitive markets have low barriers to entry. That's not true. They have no barriers to entry. So don't say that. Also try and mention a bit more sophistication in your answers. So in a perfectly competitive market, firms have perfect knowledge. In oligopolistic market structure, there can be asymmetric information. They have a few main buyers that dominate the market share. In terms of the second part of the answer, with prices, it's really important that you make key words like monopolies are price makers. They're able to restrict supply. You've got to remember the examiners are looking for buzzwords because they're going to be trying to read this as quickly as possible and give you the marks if they can. So put in those buzzwords. They'll look at those buzzwords and you'll get the marks. So price makers, not price takers. They're able to restrict supply and therefore they can charge higher prices. In terms of living standards, higher prices reduces our purchasing power. They're going to be looking for the word purchasing power. So don't blabber about stuff. Put in the keywords that examiners are going to be looking for. So decreases their purchasing power, and then there's a lack of choice because you don't have as many options in terms of what to choose from. So the fact that there's only one main provider means there's a lack of choice in what you can choose to do. This question here was the market failure question. How does the government intervene to reduce market failure? It's a couple of key things. First of all, define what market failure is at the start of your answers. Even though it doesn't ask for it, make sure you define it clearly. And then choose a market failure. Don't just say excise taxes as a market failure. One form of market failure is externalities, and then explain through the use of an example. So externalities are when there's a third-party cost to a transaction. They can lead to an over-allocation of resources to certain products. And then talk about cigarettes. Make sure you clearly and succinctly state what the negative externality is, so that people who passively smoke may get ill. That's going to increase their medical costs, that it's going to hurt the budget potentially because the government will be funding more. Then what do the government do? Well, they step in and provide excise taxes. It'd be really good if you can think of other reasons how the government step in. So not just excise taxes, but it's illegal to smoke in public places, and therefore that helps to reduce the level of passive smoking, and resources are shifted to other areas that are less harmful for society. Don't say that resources are shifted to illicit drugs and stuff like that, because we're trying to talk about why it's more efficient. So shift resources to more allocatively efficient areas by reduce the incidence of passive smoking and the health problems associated with that. So again, make sure you have a look through that response. 2D. This was answered quite well. I'll go through. I'm just going to gloss through this really quickly. You've got to be able to say that there's a surplus at the old price. Always quote the prices. That's really important. You won't get full marks unless you do quote the prices and quantities, so do that. Surplus at the old price. This is because there's been an increase in supply, so you've got to mention that, and a decrease in demand. This has led to falling prices to $100 per barrel because of the surplus and created an expansion in demand, contraction in supply. It's the price elasticity question. I'd really encourage you to go back, have a look at price elasticity, prepare for some hard questions on price elasticity. This question here was asking how lower petrol prices will affect household budgets. So the idea is that petrol has an inelastic demand. The quantity changing the quantity demanded will be less than responsive to the change in price. And because that's the case, when the price of petrol goes down, we don't demand much more of it. Okay? It's an inelastic good. We don't need that much more petrol. We're not going to drive more. So the idea is that people are not going to spend much more on petrol because it's inelastic, and therefore they're going to free up more resources for other areas. So they're going to have more in their household budget or more discretionary income to spend on other goods and services. It's really important. A lot of students ignored this impact on their household budget and didn't write anything about it. But because it's inelastic, we don't spend much more on petrol, and therefore we've got a lot more money for other areas. This last question here on petrol, how does the government intervene? The government doesn't try and make petrol cheaper so people will buy it. Don't make that mistake. It says here some students argued that the government intervenes to reduce prices because petrol is a necessity. They don't do that. It's not true. The two things that they do is that the government imposes an excise tax because it has negative externalities, and secondly, the government prevents collusion and price signalling through the ACCC. So either of those would be acceptable, but probably nothing else. We'll go through question 3 in the next video.